Well, let's start with some 2D slides, just 5 or 6 slides. And we're going to be talking now about something very important, which are the sulci and gyri. And you know that the sulci are the main roads for doing neurosurgery to recognize where the tumors are. And that's tomorrow we're going to be showing how to use the sulci in tumor surgery. Maybe we can have the lights off. Maybe. Yeah. It's interesting that for a very long time, the sulci and gyri of the brain were shown very chaotically. Neuroanatomists didn't understand that there is an organization of the sulci gyri. Okay? It was only in the 19th century that Louis-Pierre Gratiolet understood that there is an organization of the brain sulci and gyri. And that's what we're going to be talking about. Okay? We're going to be seeing details, but what I want to really like you to have in mind is that general organization here. The frontal area has 3 longitudinal gyri, just like the temporal area, the temporal lobe. And then the suprasylvian part of the brain, let's put it this way, is divided in 2 parts by 2 very well-defined oblique gyri, of course, which are the precentral and the postcentral gyrus. And then you have the parietal, and you have the occipital region. Okay? And if we go to the midline, to the mesial aspect of the brain, it's much more defined, it's much more anatomical constant. You have a very well-defined inner circle here. Of course, that it's given by the cingulate and the parahippocampal gyrus. And then you have the superior frontal and the gyrus, another not very well-defined circle around this inner circle here. And below all this, you have this continuum, the gyri of the brain regarding its enfolding process of being developed. You have this continuum among all gyres. They are continuous, as we're going to be showing here. And of course, always in the mesial aspect of it. Everything that I'm going to be talking about here is in this review of sulci and gyri that was in Journal Neurosurgery, Neurosurgical Focus, and that we had this privilege of being the main paper that was mostly seen in the series of all the journals of Journal Neurosurgery in this year, 2010. So you have this paper in the CD. So let's put our glasses and let's go through this sulci and gyri of the brain. Okay, one important thing to understand is that the pia mater, the pia is completely attached to the surface of the brain and gets inside all sulci and of the brain and fissures. Okay, and the arachnoid is just a big envelope that it's covering the whole CNS. So you have this space in between, which is the subarachnoid space, and this is to emphasize that the sulci indeed they are extensions of the subarachnoid space. If you go to the fissures, they are more constant and bigger sulci, and if you go to the base, you have the cisterns that are pretty much well defined, also cistern by cistern. And because of this enfolding process, then you have this sulci as being an extension of the subarachnoid space. Because of the enfolding process, of course, they are all continuous at the margins. So always when a sulcus ends, when a sulcus is interrupted, is because you have a connection. So the surface of the brain is continuous not only through these connections, but of course at the depth of the sulci. And just to have an idea how this enfolding process was effective, if you consider the interhemispheric fissure, 2/3 of the cortical surface are buried inside the sulci of the brain, 2/3. So it was very, very, this process was very effective in terms of increasing the cerebral surface. a very interesting issue that it's very important for us neurosurgeons is that because of the enfolding process, since this took place while the brain was bending around the center, bending around the thalamus, all the sulci from the lateral, superolateral surface and of the basal surface, they are pointing to the nearest ventricular cavity, as you can see. So this is very important when we're doing surgery. We're going to be showing this tomorrow, because if you're going through a sulcus, you always will be going towards the nearest ventricular cavity, in the superolateral surface and in the basal surface, not in the medial surface, because in the medial surface, the sulci, the development of the sulci are depending on the development of the callosum. If you don't, that's why they are parallel to the callosum, okay? If you have an agenesis of the corpus callosum, they are going to be chaotic. They are not going to be horizontal. They are going to be completely chaotic. As you can see here, the corpus callosum is developed from anterior to posterior, and you see that here you just have this very anterior part of callosum developed, and you have an agenesis of the corpus callosum, and you see that it's completely chaotic. It's not organized at all. But in the superlateral and in the basal, the sulci are always going towards the nearest ventricular cavity. As you can see here, we did remove the posterior part of the middle frontal gyrus. So you can see that the superior frontal gyrus and then the superior frontal sulcus and inferior frontal sulcus, they are going towards the ventricular cavity, as you can see here. So this can help us very much in surgery and help us to understand the architecture of the cortex of the brain. When we look at the superlateral surface of the brain, of course, what we see initially, very well defined, is the Sylvian fissure. It's called the lateral fissure of the brain, and this is always continuous. Most of the sulci are interrupted, and some sulci are not linear, and some sulci are double, as we're going to be seeing the orbital sulci, for example. But because of the development of the bending process of the brain during the development, of course, the Sylvian fissure is always continuous. And it's the only fissure that we can very safely recognize in surgery. We're going to be talking about this tomorrow. And then it separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. In the frontal lobe, we have 3 longitudinal gyri, okay? Superior frontal, middle frontal, and inferior frontal. Superior frontal sulcus, we're going to be seeing that it's usually continuous, not interrupted, and it's very deep. Inside the superior frontal gyrus, you have a mesial frontal sulcus, a medial frontal sulcus, that it's very shallow. It's not important. It's a secondary sulcus. Superior frontal sulcus is very important, and it's going to be very much used in surgery, as we're going to be showing. Inferior frontal sulcus is always interrupted, always interrupted. The middle frontal gyrus is the bigger frontal gyrus that we have. The same applies for the temporal. The superior temporal sulcus usually is a continuous sulcus. Here is a little bit interrupted, but usually is a continuous and very deep sulcus. The inferior temporal sulcus is always interrupted, not continuous, always interrupted. But the main thing here is the Sylvian fissure, okay, the lateral fissure of the brain. And you always have one point that it's more cisternal. It is an enlargement. The fissure is a little bit enlarged here. And this point was described as the Sylvian point. Nowadays, we call this anterior Sylvian point because we have a posterior Sylvian point. This anterior Sylvian point separates the posterior or lateral aspect of the Sylvian fissure from the anterior aspect of the Sylvian fissure, that it's also called sphenoidal or stem of the Sylvian fissure. This point is very important because from here you always have an anterior ascending branch and a horizontal branch. Okay? If you have these 2 branches coming here, you are always defining a triangular convolution here. Sometimes look more as an U, sometimes more like a triangle as here. This is the triangular part of the inferior frontal sulcus. Anterior you have the orbital part, of course, that is facing the orbit, and posterior you have the opercular part. The triangular part always harbors a small segment of the inferior frontal sulcus, always have this small segment coming inside the triangular part, always. But as I'm going to emphasize here, you have some convolutions that are very, very constant anatomically. And in this opercular region, why opercular region? Because operculum in Latin means curtain. And this area here, they are covering the insula. So the frontoparietal opercular is covering the superior half of the insula, and the superior temporal gyrus is covering the inferior part of the insula. So this is the temporal operculum, and this is frontoparietal operculum. Okay, so in this opercular area, the most constant anatomical convolution is the opercular part. The opercular part of the inferior frontal gyrus always have this beautiful U shape, always. If it has an U shape, it's because you have a sulcus inside coming here. And this sulcus here is always the precentral sulcus. So just by seeing this, I know that this is the opercular part, and I know that this is the precentral sulcus, precentral sulcus. So anterior Sylvian point, anterior ascending branch, anterior ascending because we have a posterior ascending, anterior ascending branch, horizontal branch, pars triangularis, triangular part, pars orbitalis, orbital part, and pars opercularis. U-shaped precentral sulcus. These three parts here, they constitute the inferior frontal gyrus. Posterior to this, we'll have anterior subcentral and posterior subcentral branches of the Sylvian fissure. Okay? You have here the first oblique gyrus and the second oblique gyrus. You see that these gyrus anterior to this, they are longitudinal. Then you have a very well-defined oblique and another very defined oblique. So this is precentral, this is postcentral. So this is central sulcus. Okay? Precentral sulcus, as we're going to be seeing, it's always interrupted because this frontal gyri, all of them, they are connected to the precentral gyrus, particularly the middle frontal, who has the largest connection, as you can see here. We're going to be seeing this in other slides also. Central sulcus is usually continuous. More than 95% of the times it is continuous. Precentral gyrus is always connected to the postcentral gyrus through this isthmus here, to this connection that used to be called inferior frontoparietal connection of Broca. Nowadays it's called subcentral gyrus. Regarding nomenclature, which is a problem in anatomy, for Sulci Gyri, we use very much the nomenclature of Yasser Gil and Mitiu Ono that did a beautiful book about Sulci Gyri. So the right name for us now is subcentral gyrus. So this is precentral, this is postcentral, this is subcentral gyrus. And anterior to the subcentral gyrus, you have the anterior subcentral sulcus and posterior subcentral sulcus. This is always like this. This area we're going to be seeing in the other slides. But this anatomy is very, very constant. And here, the opercular part, the temporal operculum, is just the superior temporal gyrus. And then you have middle temporal and inferior temporal. Inferior superior temporal sulcus and inferior temporal sulcus. Inferior temporal sulcus is always interrupted. And the inferior temporal gyrus it's very short, it's not high. It's big here at the base. But in order to expose the inferior temporal sulcus, you have to do a very basal craniotomy. If you do a regular craniotomy and you see a sulcus, it's going to be the superior temporal, not this one. To expose this one, you have to go very low. Another interesting thing is that the middle temporal gyrus usually is shorter. So the temporal pole is a connection of the superior temporal with the inferior temporal, as we're going to be seeing many slides. Orbital part we're going to be seeing later on. Now, the precentral sulcus, the central sulcus, and the postcentral sulcus, they are not branches of the Sylvian fissure. because you always have these connections here. Even here, this is the postcentral. We're going to be talking later about the postcentral. It doesn't come from here because you have a connection inside here. So the branches of the Sylvian fissure are from the anterior Sylvian point, anterior ascending, horizontal, anterior subcentral, and posterior subcentral, and then the posterior ascending branch. This is another specimen. You can see here a bigger enlargement. So this is anterior Sylvian point. So anterior Sylvian point is this enlargement because the triangular part is more retracted than the orbital part and then the opercular part. So you've come here, that's not very much well defined, but the pars triangularis usually is more retracted. Okay? So the anterior Sylvian point is always at the base of pars triangularis and just anterior to the pars opercularis, anterior Sylvian point. Pars triangularis, you always have the small branch of the inferior frontal sulcus that it's always interrupted. Of course, inferior frontal sulcus will end at the precentral. It doesn't get inside the precentral gyrus. You're seeing here the beautiful U of the opercular part harboring inside the precentral sulcus. So this is all precentral sulcus, which is interrupted by connections that are deep here and by this connection that is more superficial, that is in the inside of the middle frontal sulcus. Inside this middle frontal sulcus, you have a secondary sulcus that it's called the medial frontal sulcus. But medial frontal sulcus is not always there. It's a secondary sulcus. Important one, the most important one is the superior frontal, that it's up there. We're going to see better later on. And inferior frontal, because it's delimiting the opercular part, but it's always interrupted. And one of the main reasons that it's difficult to recognize the sulci in surgery, it's not only because they are covered by arachnoid or by vessels, it's because they are interrupted. Okay? So we're going to be identify very easy the Sylvian fissure, and as you're going to be seeing tomorrow, it's very easy to identify the superior frontal as well, because superior frontal is almost always continuous. But coming back here, you have the pars triangularis and the pars opercularis. And then you have this oblique gyrus and another oblique gyrus, precentral, postcentral. Central sulcus is right here, and here it seems that it's a branch of the Sylvian fissure. But as you know, you always have the subcentral gyrus. I'm sorry. You always have the subcentral gyrus. But in the next specimen, subcentral gyrus will be inside the fissure. So subcentral gyrus inside the fissure here. But it always has a connection, always. So the central sulcus, the precentral sulcus, and the postcentral sulcus, they are never a branch of the Sylvian fissure. If they reach, it's because this connection is, even this connection can be inside the fissure. And you have to know that. Superior temporal sulcus is very deep, pretty much continuous. There is small interruption here, but usually is a continuous sulcus. You see how long it is. It always ends posterior to the Sylvian fissure. We're going to get it there. But if we come here at the end of the Sylvian fissure, you see that you're always going to have this posterior ascending, and not always, but many times you have this descending branch of the Sylvian fissure. Anterior ascending, horizontal, anterior subcentral, posterior subcentral. Sometimes you have two, okay? But here you have only one anterior subcentral and a posterior subcentral, a posterior ascending, and anterior and a descending branch. If we come to the parietal region, we're always going to see very well the intraparietal sulcus. Intraparietal sulcus, it can be a little bit inclined, but usually it's pretty much parallel to the interhemispheric fissure. Intraparietal sulcus is pretty much always continuous with the inferior part of the postcentral. There are some authors that consider intraparietal sulcus until here. Even a very famous author like Duvernoy that has this beautiful book about the hippocampus, okay, and there's another book about sulci gyri of the brain, which is also very good. He considered intraparietal sulcus coming until here. And he considered postcentral sulcus only from here up. But Mitio Ono and most of the authors considered all this postcentral, sulcus, and interparietal just this horizontal part, longitudinal part here. But it's interesting to mention this to emphasize that the interparietal sulcus usually is continuous with the inferior part of the postcentral. You're going to be seeing many specimens. What is important about the interparietal sulcus is that it's very deep, is the closest way to get to the atrium. We're going to be talking about this tomorrow. Very deep, very well defined, okay, and separates the parietal lobe in two parietal lobules, the superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule. Superior parietal lobule, we're going to see better on other slides, is a quadrangular convolution, and inferior parietal lobule is always constituted by two gyri, two semicircular gyri. The most anterior one, does anybody remember the name? It is the supramarginal, and the posterior one is the angular. Okay? Supramarginal gyrus is very well defined always, and always is a continuation of the superior temporal, always. Angular gyrus, here you can see very well as a horseshoe convolution, as you can see in any books, but usually is not this well defined. So we call areas. By the way, a gyrus, we have to understand the concept of a gyrus as being an area. It's not a very well-defined structure. It varies very much, but you have landmarks that are pretty much the same. Supramarginal gyrus, just like pars opercularis, is very constant. Always have the shape, and it's always continuous with the superior temporal gyrus. Okay? And always go around the end of the Sylvian fissure, always. This part here is not supramarginal gyrus anymore. This is the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus. Okay, supramarginal, as the name is saying, is superior to the margin, which would be the fissure here. So this is supramarginal. Why I'm saying that this piece is supramarginal? Because it's continuous with the superior temporal. So you have to check one thing and the other to recognize this thing. And of course, nowadays you can go to the radiology and study the sulci gyri of your patient with this 3D reconstruction they can do for us. And this is good if you're operating on a lobar glioma, okay? The angular gyrus is then always continuous with the middle temporal. And the inferior temporal is continuous with the inferior occipital. If we come to the occipital region, it's much more variable in humans, the lateral aspect of the occipital region. But you're always going to be very well defined inferior occipital, which is continuous with inferior temporal. And you're going to have a superior occipital, which is vertical. We're not seeing here. The middle occipital, that in this case we're seeing very well, when you can see it very well, it's always longitudinal. It's parallel to the inferior. So this is inferior, middle occipital, inferior occipital, and we're not seeing superior occipital. But you see that there is an organization here. Superior temporal gyrus continues with the supramarginal, middle temporal gyrus continues with the angular, and inferior temporal continues with inferior occipital. Now, let's come now to the superior temporal gyrus. Superior temporal sulcus. Superior temporal sulcus always end at the point that is slightly posterior to the posterior Sylvian point. This is anterior Sylvian point, this is posterior Sylvian point. And here, the superior temporal sulcus usually trifurcates. Sometimes you don't have this most inferior part very well delineated, but you always have one sulcus that goes superior and another branch of sulcus that go posterior. And this posterior part here always gets inside the angular gyrus. Just like the Sylvian fissure ends inside the supramarginal, the superior temporal sulcus ends inside the angular. So this is a general organization. This sulcus that separates the supramarginal from the angular, it's always there. It's called intermediary sulcus. It's also called intermediary sulcus of Jensen, has this name, Jensen. There was an old neuroanatomist. Now, the intermediary sulcus can be a superior aspect of the superior temporal sulcus, or a branch of the intraparietal. In this case, it's the same. You see, this sulcus here came from the intraparietal and also from the superior temporal. Then you have a secondary sulcus here, but it's not separating both. This is inside. This is a secondary sulcus inside the supramarginal. Very frequently, you have one intermediary sulcus coming into here, and then you have another intermediary sulcus coming here, and then you have a connection between the angular and the supramarginal. So you have to know this general organization in order to identify the sulci gyri of the brain. If we go to MRIs, we're going to be seeing pretty much the same thing, okay? This is anterior Sylvian point. So this is pars triangularis. What is this beautiful U here? Pars opercularis. So what sulcus is this? Precentral. So just by knowing this, you can identify. The precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus together, they constitute what is called the central lobe, okay? Let's tell you, if you go to the nomina, you have frontal lobe, you have parietal lobe, you have occipital lobe, you have temporal lobe, you have insular lobe, and now you have limbic lobe. These are the lobes you see in insula, in the nomina, okay? But since Penfield, this area here is called central area by Penfield and Rasmussen, and Yasagil called this central lobe. And central lobe will get into the nomina also, because central lobe let me come back here. This is central lobe. There's this connection here with the subcentral gyrus, and you have a connection in the midline, which is the paracentral lobule. So the central lobe is it's just like an ellipse that it's excavated by the central sulcus. It's a morphological unit, and it's also a functional unit as well. They work together. Okay, so it's very different to have a tumor here or to have a tumor here. So the frontal lobe is something, the central lobe is something different. So Yasagil is correct in the sense of calling this the central lobe. And the central lobe in the MRI always look like this with this quadrangular shape also. When you see this quadrangular shape, this is central lobe, and this is central sulcus. This is precentral that gets inside the opercular part. And this is, of course, is postcentral that is continuous with the intraparietal. Superior temporal, and the superior branch is here separating the supramarginal from the angular gyrus. If we had, you agree that this branch of sulcus here is inside the angular gyrus? So I bet that if we had a cut more toward us, we would see a branch, a sulcus here, because always is there. You see, this is very constant. Some features are very constant. And you have to have in mind, if you're paying attention, you're going to recognize this at the end of this lecture. So where is this nidus? You know, exactly, where is this nidus? You can't say this nidus is in the frontal lobe, right? Even you cannot say that this nidus is in the inferior frontal gyrus. Where is this nidus? This nidus is in the anterior aspect of the pars opercularis. Okay, so just by knowing these features, you are recognizing this now. And tomorrow you're going to be seeing the skull or the head of your patient, and you know exactly where it is. That's what we're going to be showing tomorrow. Let me come back here and say that when Broca described the Broca area, so-called Broca area, it included the posterior part of the triangular part and the anterior part of the opercular part. He called this connection here, which they used to be called pli de passage, was a name given by Gratiolet, pli de passage, a connection between the pars opercularis and the precentral gyrus. You always have this connection here, always, that goes superior to the anterior subcentral branch. Okay? Broca area is a very well-defined area. If you have a contusion here and you open to take your subdural, don't take this contusion, because if you take this contusion, your patient will not be able to tell you thank you. Okay, but the Wernicke area, that we're going to be talking about. Wernicke area is more spread. If you take a contusion here, I would say that most of the patients will not have a language problem. Some of them will. This is more spread. And what's the definition of Wernicke area? Is the most distal part of the superior temporal gyrus, which is here, and the base of supramarginal. But this is pretty much spread, not like frontal. And of course, we understand language, all this peri-Sylvian area here that we talked about, and related with the IFOF and the arachnoid fascicle that we showed in the morning, okay? So I was remembering this because this nidus is exactly in the pars opercularis, exactly in the pars opercularis, and exactly in the core of the so-called Broca area, right? Okay, now this slide, I always say that if I had to give a lecture with only one slide, this would be the slide that I will use to give a whole lecture, because there are so many things here. But let's start here. You see, if you see an oblique gyrus, of course this is precentral and postcentral. All gyri here are longitudinal, and the others here are semicircular. So it's very easy to identify the pre and the postcentral gyrus. And of course the central sulcus inside here. And you always have this connection here, just like you have the subcentral. So what is this connection here? This is the paracentral lobule. This is the paracentral lobule. And you see how the paracentral lobule is posterior? It's over the atrium. It's very much posterior. It's lying over the atrium, as you can see here. Superior frontal gyrus, we're going to be talking about this later. But this slide at this point is not to talk about the insula. This is the central core. We talked so much this morning, okay? But you see the pars orbitalis. Pars orbitalis is not part of the operculum because it's not covering the operculum. Let's come back here. The operculum doesn't include the pars orbitalis. It includes the posterior part, the pars triangularis. Pars triangularis is covering just the most anterior gyrus of the insula, the anterior short gyrus of the insula, the most anterior one. Pars opercularis was called pars opercularis because they understood in the past that pars opercularis was really already covering the insula. Operculum means curtain. But the pars triangularis is also covering only the anterior short gyrus of the insula. So the opercular part begins at pars triangularis and goes until the postcentral and the beginning of the supramarginal, as we're going to be seeing, mostly the postcentral gyrus. Okay, this is pars, this is the frontal parietal operculum. Okay, so central core of the brain. Is Johnny here? I think he left because we were talking about this region here. But this slide is mostly at this point to show this other surface of the brain, which is the superior temporal surface, the opercular surface of the temporal lobe. And you can see a very well-defined gyrus here, which is the Heschel gyrus. I forgot to tell you that all gyri that are inside the fissures, it's called generically a transverse gyrus. It turns out that this is the bigger transverse gyrus we have, because this is inside the Sylvian fissure, right? So this is the Heschel gyrus, is the transverse Heschel gyrus, the biggest transverse gyrus we have. And it's always pointing in the atrium, always pointing in the atrium. But at this point, you see that it divides the opercular surface in two different regions. One is very oblique. It's called polar plane. Easy to remember because it's close to the pole, temporal pole that is here. Very oblique. And then you have this triangle here that it's the temporal plane. The temporal plane is very flat. That's what we were talking about because Johnny has a cavernoma to operate right here. And he wants to come, opening the Sylvian fissure and come here. What I was saying to him is that difficult to open the Sylvian fissure at this point here because, number one, you open like this. This is an angle that you have. And the other thing is that it's flat. It slides. It's difficult to open. So if you want to come here, you have to take a little piece of the hasal gyrus here to come in here, which is fine, you know, but this left side he was talking about, you have to avoid the cortex because, of course, you're dealing with the Wernicke area. This is the Wernicke area, the posterior aspect of the superior temporal gyrus. By the way, all the surface that we're talking about belongs to the superior temporal gyrus. Is the superior surface of the superior temporal gyrus. So hasal gyrus divides the superior surface into polar plane and temporal plane. Geschwin showed in the past that the temporal plane is bigger in the left hemisphere because it's related with the development of language. It seems that it really is, okay? And hasal gyrus, of course, is always running posterior to the central cord towards the atrium. So when you see a fissure like this, oblique, you know that you are anterior to the hasal gyrus. You know that you are in the polar plane. If you see a fissure like this, it's because you are posterior to the hasal gyrus. It's flat, okay? Ways of looking at the MRI. So this is another specimen. And what is this here? Of course, beautiful U. You know, when you see such a beautiful U, it's just like a paracentral lobule. You look, you recognize, because it's always constant. So what is this here? Precentral, subcentral gyrus, central sulcus, postcentral sulcus, supramarginal gyrus continues with the superior temporal. Okay? Now, insula. What gyrus is this here? Hasal gyrus, because it's going posterior to the insula. And at this point, what I want to show is that the postcentral gyrus is always sitting in the hasal gyrus. So this is another relationship we have to have in mind. Postcentral gyrus is always sitting on the hasal gyrus. And you see this bump here? That's how neuroradiologists recognize the hasal gyrus. Look here. That's how they recognize the hasal gyrus. Hasal gyrus is always going towards the atrium, okay? And always has the small bump here, which is this here, okay? And you have always the postcentral gyrus sitting here. So if you see this, you can know that this is postcentral gyrus. This is central sulcus. This is precentral sulcus. We're not seeing the opercular part because this is deeper. It's a deeper cortex. So by seeing these landmarks, you can know where you are. So always when I look at MRIs, I try to know where the hasal gyrus is. Because seeing the hasal gyrus, I know a lot of things. I know exactly a lot of things, and tomorrow we're going to be seeing that this is sitting over the petrous bone. So I know exactly where also these things are in the skull. Okay, this is to remind me that I have to start talking about the insula here. You have a huge anterior Sylvian point here. Huge anterior Sylvian point. And this anterior Sylvian point is exactly over the most superior aspect of the insula. Of course, it's called the apex of the insula. This is the apex of the insula. So when you open the fissure, just underneath the anterior Sylvian point, you're going to be finding the apex of the insula. So the apex of the insula, very easy to expose. Okay, very easy. What is this beautiful thing here? You see the pars opercularis that is covering the anterior part of the insula, precentral sulcus, central sulcus, subcentral gyrus. Okay, pars triangularis. This is huge because you see pars triangularis very much retracted. Everything is retracted here, but particularly the pars triangularis is always more retracted. That's why you have an enlargement of the fissure underneath the pars triangularis. And it's pointing underneath where is the apex of the insula. And you always have this branch of the inferior frontal sulcus getting in here. This is a way to double check if you're right. Pars orbitalis is not covering the insula. You see that pars triangularis is covering the most anterior short gyrus of the insula. These relationships I'm showing, they are always there. Like a nose, can be bigger or smaller, but it looks like a nose, always. Okay? I just put this slide here to emphasize that you should read this paper by Touré. This is not only the best paper about the insula, but it's one of the best papers of anatomy. In this paper, he shows all the operculum and all the insula, many things that we'll be talking about. It's a very, you can see this reference anywhere, Touré's paper. Well, we always, like I said in the corpus callosum, we always figure the corpus callosum in the midline. We always think about the insula, its lateral aspect. But the insula has a big anterior wall, as you see here. Okay, a big anterior wall. This is the lateral aspect and lateral wall of the insula, but it has a big wall. And this big wall, the anterior wall, this anterior wall is covered by the posterior orbital gyrus. If you remove anatomically the posterior orbital gyrus, you're exposing the anterior wall of the insula. So when you go back, I was talking to someone here, you have to have a small lab where you can go and dissect. And when you go there, don't do the brain cuttings that you were taught to do. Remove the brain gyrus by gyrus, sulcus by sulcus, to understand its architecture. If you remove anatomically the posterior orbital gyrus, you're going to be exposing the anterior surface of the insula. Remember then the insula is the external shield of the central core. And anterior half related with the head of the caudate, posterior half related with the thalamus. In between, posterior limb, anterior limb, and the geniule is pretty much in the middle, related with the foramen Monroe. Central core, you have to have this in mind. And hascial gyrus going posterior to it, always towards the atrium. And the thalamus is the head of the brainstem. So here, going down, you have the brainstem. Have to have this architecture in mind. Okay, just like here, the head of the brainstem. And the central core right here. If we look at the, to expose the insula, I did remove its curtains. Okay, so down here, I just did remove the superior temporal gyrus. Middle temporal gyrus, not covering the insula, not opercular structure. To remove here, I left the orbital part. I did remove the tip here of the pars triangularis, the pars opercularis, the subcentral gyrus, okay, the postcentral gyrus, okay. This is you see, this is the first oblique gyrus. No, this is longitudinal here. This is oblique. So this is precentral gyrus. This is postcentral gyrus. Postcentral gyrus, part of operculum, and just a little bit of supramarginal, but mostly the postcentral is covering the posterior aspect of the insula. Of course, because remember that the hascial gyrus belong to the superior temporal gyrus. Hascial gyrus were going posterior to the insula. Postcentral gyrus is sitting in the anterior aspect of the hascial gyrus. So supramarginal, that it's posterior, not related with the insula anymore. We're going to be seeing that the supramarginal gyrus is over the atrium. If you want to go to the atrium in the right side, you can do a beautiful window in the supramarginal gyrus. So if I remove the operculum, okay, I expose the insula. If I look at the insula, I see that there are two types of gyri here. Some gyri that come from a common point, a common area, and other gyri that are not related with this common area. This common area I'm talking about is the apex. Anatomy is not mathematics, okay? Anatomy varies. So here you have two apex. But this is the main one because it's the top and it's the more anterior, would be just underneath the anterior Sylvian point. But all the gyri, anatomy is always definition. So all the gyri that comes from the apex, they are called short gyri. So this looks like long, but this is not long gyrus. This is short gyrus. because it's coming from the apex. The long gyra of the insula, usually they are 2, not 3, okay? Many times they look like a Y. You have a single one bifurcating here, okay? They are long gyra. They are not related with the apex. And the sulcus that separates the short gyri from the long gyri is the central sulcus of the insula. And the central sulcus of the insula is always continuous with the central sulcus of the brain. Always there. Is that the central sulcus of the brain? Yes, this is postcentral, precentral sulcus. Here always longitudinal. So this is an organization that it's always there. Around the insula, we have this sulcus that used to be called the circular sulcus of the insula. But it's just like saying you're going to Europe, okay? You have to specify. So now we call this anterior limiting sulcus, superior limiting sulcus, and inferior limiting sulcus. Superior limiting, inferior limiting, and anterior limiting. The superior limiting sulcus and inferior limiting sulcus of the insula are very shallow. They are just deflections, okay, from the insular surface to the intraopercular surface. Now, the anterior limiting sulcus is very deep. It's everything that is in between the anterior wall of the insula and the posterior orbital gyrus. So it's a real fissure here. And we can explore this surgically, as we're going to be seeing. Orbital part, not related with the insula. Just like Heschel gyrus, not related of the insula, the most posterior aspect. Most anterior aspect would be related with the end of the insula, because it's oblique here. And this fiber dissection shows very well that the short gyrus of the insula come from the apex. They arise from the apex. And you see here we would have a Y-shaped, one single that would be bifurcating, but not related with the apex. Indeed, if you want to know the real configuration, you should see what is happening underneath the cortex, just like here. Now, the sulcus around the insula is interrupted down here. And where it's interrupted, we call liming insula. Let's show this better. In the next slide, we'll have the superior temporal gyrus left here, okay? So this is superior temporal gyrus. We are bringing the temporal operculum down here. We are exposing the apex of the insula. And I did remove only the pars triangularis to expose only the anterior aspect of the insula. What is this beautiful U here? You see two sulcus here. Of course, the first one is the precentral. Okay, so this is pars opercularis, always this beautiful. Anterior subcentral, posterior subcentral, central sulcus, subcentral gyrus, precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus. If you come from one landmark, you can identify everything, as you can see, okay? So you have the apex here. Now, you see that you have a sulcus here and a sulcus there, and you have an interruption. Always when you have an interruption is because you have a connection. So here you have a small gyrus that is coming from the apex, and it's going towards the posterior orbital gyrus. This gyrus here is called transverse gyrus of the insula. And the transverse gyrus of the insula comes from the apex, go towards the posterior orbital gyrus, okay? And is just above the liming insula. Liming insula is this U-shaped area here, okay, where you have the most anterior aspect of the insula. And you have the interruption of the anterior limiting and inferior limiting because you have the transverse gyrus going through here. So the transverse gyrus is exactly where the liming insula is. If you have an aneurysm with a short M1, it's going to be hard. If you have a long M1, it's going to be more here. It's going to be much easier. So you have to use this anatomical knowledge to figure where the structures are. Now let's explore more this space in the anterior wall of the insula, okay? If we go through this space here, which is the anterior limiting sulcus, we'll reach a recess of the frontal horn by just cutting the anterior limb of the internal capsule. When I showed this morning, when I showed this morning the inferior horn, I didn't mention that there is a recess just anterior to the hippocampus head, to the head of hippocampus. There is a recess in between the amygdala and the hippocampus head. You always see this in surgery, I bet, right? You always have this recess, just a similar recess, just anterior to the head of the caudate here. And it's interesting that if you go here, you get into this recess. Just like we did here, you see that we went through the limiting sulcus, anterior limiting sulcus, cut here the anterior limb, got into the ventricle, and did not damage the head of the caudate because we get exactly where this recess is. So these are anatomical details that it's nice to have, nice to know, okay? You can see here the temporal pole, which is the superior temple getting together with inferior temporal, okay? What sulcus is this here? A rhino. This is uncus and this is temporal pole. This is neocortex, this is paleocortex. So this is rhinosulcus. Okay, details that are interesting to see. You see that the pars opercularis is already covering the anterior half of the insula, but we did remove the pars triangularis, that it's covering the anterior short gyrus of the insula. So if we open widely the Sylvian fissure, and we open the horizontal part and the anterior limiting and the anterior ascending part, or in the right side, if we remove this operculum, which it doesn't create any problem, we'll be exposing the anterior limiting sulcus of the insula. And you see how close we are from the ventricular cavity. So if you're operating a GBM here, very easily you're going to get into the anterior horn because it's very close, you see, very close. But you have to be above the apex. If you are below the apex, okay, where are you going to get? This is very anterior, but you're going to get in the ventus striatum, that it's just posterior to this region. You don't want to get there. So the last lecture I'm going to give tomorrow, I intend to show all this ventus striatum area from the piterional view. Okay, so if you take the apex, and easy to know where the apex is because it's just underneath the anterior Sylvian point, if you are superior to the apex, you are related with the ventricular cavity. If you are below the apex, you are related with the ventus striatum. So you see, these landmarks are very important to have in mind, and you're very close to the ventricular cavity. So just by looking at this, you're building your knowledge of the architecture of the brain. And posteriorly, of course, you have the Heschel gyrus that will always take you to the atrium. The easiest way to get to the atrium is just open the fissure and put your finger along the Heschel gyrus. You're always going to put your finger inside the atrium. And again, the paracentral lobule is lying over the atrium. It's very posterior. Usually things are more posterior than we think. Seen from above, a beautiful U here, a beautiful U here. So what is this? What is it? Paracentral lobule. Okay. What sulcus is this? Superior temporal sulcus, superior frontal sulcus. This is medial sulcus, medial frontal sulcus, very shallow. Sometimes you see in this side you don't have it. You don't have to consider this. Middle frontal gyrus, you see the superficial connection. This is another specimen, it's always there. Superior frontal gyrus is always connected, and the connection usually is more medial, as you can see here. Superior frontal sulcus always will reach the precentral sulcus. This is precentral sulcus. And it's always interrupted, as it's interrupted here, always interrupted here. Tomorrow, when we talk about sulcal key points in order to recognize the sulci in surgery, one important thing is that when two important sulci get together, you usually have an enlargement of the subarachnoid space. So that's a way to recognize the sulci from the sulcal key points. Now, superior frontal gyrus is very important. And the most medial and posterior part correspond to what area? What do you call this area? Exactly, SMA, supplementary motor area. For who do tumors, this is very, very important. There is a paper of a cooperative study of low-grade gliomas in France that showed that 50% of low-grade gliomas are in the superior frontal gyrus and insular tumors. If you take together insular low grades and SMA or superior frontal gyrus low grades, they constitute 50% of low-grade gliomas. So any one of us operates lots of tumors here, lots of tumors here. And you have the SMA syndrome that you probably know about. And Dufour wrote a lot of very nice things about this. So this area is very important for tumor surgery, very important. Paracentral lobule, central sulcus. So this is a very old MRI, but you can see here that the tumor is in the superior, in the precentral gyrus, because it goes along the gyrus. And then through that connection that it's always there, go to the middle frontal, and underneath also goes to the superior frontal. So, of course, you can if you know the connections, you can understand what the tumor is going through, and you can plan your surgery, of course. Now, let's see more posteriorly. You always recognize, of course, when you look to someone, you go for what is more common, okay? Always look for the beautiful use. What is this again? Paracentral lobule. Always. Beautiful U, paracentral lobule. So this is central. Okay, now if we come to the parietal region, we already talked about the sulcus. What sulcus is this? You have to know what sulcus is this. I'm in what area am I here? Parietal. So if I'm showing a deep sulcus, it has to be the interparietal. Okay, so interparietal sulcus. So interparietal sulcus is continuous here. So what sulcus is that? What sulcus is this? I'm sorry, here. Didn't I say that the interparietal sulcus is almost always continuous with the postcentral? Okay, so interparietal, this is postcentral. Central sulcus is coming up here. So this is really postcentral. Interparietal sulcus. So what gyrus is this here? This is superior parietal lobule. This is inferior parietal lobule. What gyrus is this? Supramarginal. It's not written, but you have to know because it's the most anterior gyrus related with the inferior aspect of the interparietal sulcus, where it's turning into postcentral. So this is supramarginal. And what gyrus is this? Angular. It has to be the angular because it's underneath the interparietal. It cannot be another one. Okay, now you're always going to have here this incisure, this deep sulcus here. What is this deep sulcus? Let's see here. What sulcus is this? The calcarine. Beautiful cuneus here, and this is lingual. So this is calcarine. What sulcus is this? Pardon? Parieto-occipital sulcus. Parieto-occipital sulcus, some people call fissure because it's very deep. It's so deep that you always have this incisure here. Okay? In the past, look how interesting this is. In the past, they used to call the parietal occipital sulcus internal perpendicular fissure because it's perpendicular to the calcarean fissure. So they used to call this internal calcarean fissure, internal perpendicular fissure, and used to call this external perpendicular fissure. Now the name for this is parietal occipital incisure. Parietal occipital incisure is nothing more than the depth of parietal occipital sulcus. You can call this parietal occipital sulcus because this is parietal occipital sulcus. When it ends, you always have a connection. And this is a third beautiful U I'm showing you. Third or fourth, because subcentral gyrus is almost a beautiful U also. But you always have this beautiful U here, always. Tomorrow we're going to be seeing this in occipital surgery. Always have this. And this was called by old authors, parietal occipital connection of Gratiolet. Pli de passage, parietal occipital connection of Gratiolet. It's always there. Now, the radiology nomenclature, they call this parietal occipital arc, which I think is a good name, parietal occipital arc. But you always have this beautiful U here. So this is parietal occipital sulcus. So what gyrus is this here inside the fissure? What gyrus is this? The cuneus. If we come to the occipital region, in this side is more chaotic, but in this side, anatomically very well defined, an inferior occipital gyrus, a middle occipital gyrus, and a superior occipital gyrus. Superior occipital gyrus is always vertical. Here it is. Superior occipital gyrus. And superior occipital gyrus is the same piece of brain as the cuneus. If this is cuneus, what's the name of this? Precuneus. So precuneus would be here. What's the name of this piece of brain here? Superior parietal lobule. Superior parietal lobule and precuneus is the same piece of brain, the same convolution. But if you look here, you call precuneus. If you look here, you call superior parietal lobule, just names. But it's the same piece of brain, it's continuous. Just like the superior occipital gyrus is the same piece of brain as the cuneus, is the superolateral aspect of the cuneus, of course. Just names. You have to understand the architecture, not the names. Superior occipital gyrus, inferior occipital gyrus. Inferior occipital gyrus will be always continuous with inferior temporal gyrus. But inferior temporal gyrus, continuous with inferior occipital, will go around the corner and will become what inside here? Lingual gyrus. So you see, this is an organization. It might differ, but it's always there. So you have a real ring going around here. Inferior temporal gyrus, inferior occipital gyrus, and lingual gyrus. And it's interesting that the lingual gyrus is the main thing that will be continuous with the parahippocampal gyrus, as we're going to be showing. So you have parahippocampal gyrus, lingual gyrus, inferior occipital, and inferior temporal. You see there's a ring around it. Always there. Now, the middle occipital is very variable. Sometimes you have, sometimes you don't. Here, you can say that this area is the inferior occipital. And of course, you see that it's continuing with the lingual here. This is calcarean fissure here. So you see that inferior occipital is continuous with the lingual. Just like superior occipital is continuous with the cuneus. Now, this region here gets very complicated in humans. Okay, but I would call here the area of the inferior, the middle occipital gyrus if I have a cavernoma here. Okay, so you have to understand this as regions. And our aim here is for you to know all these things, all these features, in order to understand the architecture of the brain. You look at the brain and know the whole architecture of it. So the parietal occipital gyrus, sulcus, of course, separates parietal lobe from occipital lobe. So the intraparietal sulcus, when it comes in here, it becomes intraoccipital. So this is intraoccipital, this is intraparietal. But names. Some anatomists call the intraoccipital the superior occipital. It's the same sulcus. Superior occipital and interoccipital, the same. In that paper of Sulci Gyri of the brain that you have in the CD, everything of this is all discussed there. So you see there's very much an organization here. The medial aspect of the brain is very constant anatomically. Why? Because it's older. You have the cingulate gyrus that it's continuous with the parahippocampal gyrus. Okay, and you see the lingual gyrus here. This is calcan fissure, parietal occipital, cuneo. So this is lingual gyrus. You see how the lingual gyrus is continuous with the parahippocampal. This is the beginning of the calcan fissure. We'll get there. Cingulate gyrus. And then what is this piece? Does anybody know what's the name of this piece of brain that is putting together the cingulate with the parahippocampal? The cingulate gyrus becomes narrow here. The isthmus. Okay? People say the isthmus of the cingulate gyrus, but the right thing is the isthmus. Isthmus that put together the cingulate and the parahippocampal. And by definition, the beginning of the calcan fissure separates what is isthmus from what is parahippocampal gyrus. So parahippocampal gyrus anatomically begins just underneath, inferior to the calcan fissure here. So this is parahippocampal gyrus. Of course, this is the uncus, apex of the uncus, okay? And the sulcus that gets inside the uncus, of course, is the uncal sulcus. The anterior half, you know that the amygdala will be here, and the head of hippocampus will be there, posterior, okay? And this flat surface, upper surface, is the subiculum that we talked about. Callosal sulcus. Callosal sulcus. Cingulate sulcus. Cingulate sulcus. Cingulate sulcus always ends ascending here, and it's very deep. That's how radiologists recognize the paracentral lobule, because they see this big depth of the terminal ascending part of the cingulate sulcus. Everything that is anterior is paracentral lobule. And of course, this is called paracentral sulcus. Always also a branch of the cingulate sulcus. This is part of the paracentral lobule. Okay, this is the real image of the central paracentral, but this is part of it. So what sulcus is this here? The central sulcus, paracentral sulcus. This is the inner surface, medial surface of the superior frontal gyrus. Some people call this medial frontal gyrus, but Yasagil, Ono, all these people call this inner surface, medial surface of the superior frontal gyrus. Superior frontal gyrus is all this here. You know, there's no medial frontal gyrus. Superior frontal gyrus. And superior frontal gyrus is always continuous with this gyrus here. What gyrus is this? What gyrus is this? It's exactly what you're thinking. What gyrus is this? The rectus gyrus, of course. This is cingulum, cingulate gyrus. Superior rostral. You have everything that is facing down is rostral, right? Rostrum of callosum, rostrum, genio of callosum, trunk, splenium, fornix, massa intermedia. We went through this in the morning. Superior rostral sulcus. Superior rostral sulcus always separates rectus gyrus from the cingulate gyrus, always. And you always have this connection here that Yasagil calls the cingulate pole, that puts together, connect the cingulate gyrus with the rectus gyrus. You always have this. And behind you have the septal area. We're going to get into there soon. Cingulate gyrus, cingulate pole. And then superior rostral sulcus. And then you have the inferior rostral sulcus that it's always inside the rectus gyrus. Inferior rostral is inside the rectus gyrus. This area here is very constant because it's very old phylogenetically. Talked about that. Well, this slide is just to come back to this area with more details. Okay, you see what is this connection here? It's another beautiful U. Just talked about. Is the cingulate pole. Don't forget this name, cingulate pole. Here, if this is the cingulate pole, putting together the cingulate gyrus with the rectus gyrus, what sulcus is this again? Superior rostral. And inferior rostral is always inside the rectus gyrus. This is what part of the fornix? The column of the fornix or pillar of the fornix. What is this just anterior here? Anterior commissure. Okay? And then you see 3 small gyri here. The most anterior one is the paraterminal gyrus. It's where the indusium griseum, you would have here the hippocampus. Gyrus fasciolaris would go around the splenium here and continues with the indusium griseum here. And indusium griseum will end at the paraterminal gyrus. This is not important, it's just vestigial, but paraterminal gyrus harbors the septonucleus, so it's very important. And then you have 2 small gyri here posterior, which is the anterior parofactory and the posterior parofactory. You have anterior parofactory sulcus and posterior parofactory sulcus. This region is also called paraolfactory area of Broca. But, it's pretty much together with the septal area. Septal area, indeed, if you want to be strict, septal area will be just the paraterminal gyrus. But this is all septal area here. Okay? This is septum pellucidum, which is the false septum. Now let's see here the cingulate getting together with the parahippocampal. We're going to open here. If we open this area, what are you seeing? We're seeing the thalamus, we're seeing the fimbria, the dentate. What's the name? This is the uncus, sulcus. What's the name of this flat surface here where the pulvinar is resting? The subiculum. This is corpus callosum, splenium getting in here. This is the parahippocampal gyrus. What gyrus is this? This is continuous here. This is corpus callosum. This is the isthmus. This is the isthmus of the cingulate. So what gyrus is this? The lingual. So you see how deep is the calcarean fissure? It's very deep. Sometimes the PCA gets inside there. Okay? Very, very deep. That's why you have the calcar avis, that it's prominent. It's a prominence almost in the ventricular wall because the calcarean fissure is very deep. So you see that the parahippocampal gyrus is just like the stem of a tree, and the main branches are the isthmus and the lingual. Maybe the lingual is bigger than the isthmus itself. So you see this is the parahippocampal gyrus. And the splenium also gets inside here. You see that gets inside here. And you have the precuneus coming there with its contribution here to the parahippocampal gyrus as well. If you go to MRI, you're going to see all this. I forget to emphasize that you always have the cingulate gyrus here, and you always have this connection with the superior frontal gyrus. You always have this connection, which is here. Cingulate, this is the cingulate pole here. This is rectus gyrus. You see the superior rostral and the inferior rostral inside the rectus gyrus. You see the cingulate sulcus ascending here very deep. That's why this is very black. And everything that is anterior to the ascending part of the cingulate is what? Paracentral lobule. That's how they recognize the neuroradiology. They see this and everything that is anterior, paracentral lobule. So what's the name of this sulcus here? Paracentral. This is paracentral. The central sulcus would be inside here. This is central sulcus, right? This is paracentral. And this is all superior frontal, that it continues with the rectus gyrus. I didn't mention this multiple Y-shaped sulci here, which does anybody know the name of it? Multiple Y-shaped? Subparietal sulcus. Altogether, they constitute the subparietal sulcus that are inside what piece of brain is this? Posterior to the paracentral lobule, what do we have here? The precuneus. You see the cuneus is here, this is lingogyrus. This is the flow void of the PCA. PCA, parietal occipital branch and calcarine branch, the distal branches of the PCA. And they, of course, run in the parietal occipital sulcus and in the calcarine fissure. The visual primary area is just the posterior half of the calcarine fissure. Here you don't have a visual cortical area in this anterior part. That's why one way of getting to the atrium is to remove the isthmus. You can remove this, you don't cause any visual problem. So you can see all this in the MRI. Let's end, almost finishing here with the base, okay? And you see the orbital sulci. The orbital sulci always have this sort of H-shaped. It looks like an H. And one thing that I always say in the lectures is that they are very variable, the orbital gyri. But the posterior orbital gyrus always look like a Napoleon hat. Always, you see? You always have this here, always. And when you see this, remember this is covering the anterior wall of the insula. So, of course, this is rectus gyrus, interhemispheric fissure, rectus gyrus, olfactory sulcus, and this is medial orbital. This is anterior orbital gyrus, posterior orbital gyrus, and lateral orbital gyrus. Of course, lateral orbital gyrus will be continuous with the orbital part of the inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, so this H, you see this H here. You see again the Napoleon hat here. You see this is posterior orbital. This is medial orbital. This is anterior orbital gyrus, and this is lateral orbital gyrus. So you have 4 orbital gyri here, and the lateral is continuous with the orbital part of inferior frontal gyrus. It's easy because they are continuous. The names can tell you what they mean, okay? You see the temporal pole. The temporal pole is the superior temporal gyrus together with the inferior. You see that the middle is more retracted. Here, you have the superior and the inferior getting together. And what sulcus is this? Just posterior? What sulcus is this? The rhinal, because that's the uncus. Anterior part of the uncus that will be facing the carotid artery will be right here. Bifurcation just underneath the anterior perforate substance, as we talked about. And the posterior part of the triangle is facing the peduncle, the midbrain. So you already have all this in mind. If you go to the base, in this side you have a beautiful fusiform gyrus, and you have a lingogyrus here. Somebody asked about the collateral sulcus. You see in this specimen, collateral sulcus is coming from the occipital pole and going until the temporal pole. This is all collateral sulcus. Parahippocampal gyrus. Does anybody know the name of this sulcus here? This is interrupted here, but this is a sulcus. This is the occipitotemporal. So the fusiform gyrus has laterally the occipitotemporal sulcus and medially the collateral sulcus. This is rhinal. But very frequently, the collateral sulcus is continuous with the rhinal. Not in this case, but usually, many times, it's continuous. Fusiform gyrus, the tip is always at the level of the midbrain. In this place, I would say it's here. I would call all this area here the fusiform. Some books say that the lingual gyrus is the medial temporal occipital, and fusiform is the lateral temporal occipital gyri, just different names. This is lateral temporal occipital, this is medial temporal occipital. But it's much common to call this fusiform and this lingual gyrus. Of course, this is inferior temporal, inferior occipital, goes around the corner, begins lingual, and lingual is continuous with the parahippocampal. This is a ring, as we already saw there. Collateral sulcus, parahippocampal collateral sulcus, fusiform gyrus, inferior temporal. Occipital temporal, I'm sorry. Occipital temporal. Parahippocampal gyrus, parahippocampal gyrus, fusiform gyrus, is the floor of the ventricle, as we showed in the morning, and this is inferior temporal already. You see how the inferior temporal sulcus is very low? It's difficult to expose. You have to do a very low craniotomy to expose very well the inferior temporal gyrus. Well, I'm not going to repeat. This slide will be talking about the anterior perforate substance and the posterior perforate substance that I think that we went through this in the morning. I think I'll stop in this slide unless you have any questions in order to save time for our dinner and maybe going around the institute if you want. If you guys have any questions, maybe you can turn on the lights. Okay, so these are the Sulci Gyri. Tomorrow we will come back to this, talking about how to identify them in surgery. It's very easy. If you know these main landmarks, you're going to always recognize. Now, as everything, you have to practice. So when you go back to your departments, when you see MRIs, always try to recognize the main sulci in convolution in MRIs, always. Always try to see where they are, even seeing normal MRIs. You have to study this. You have to do this every day in order to have this in your mind.
Questions for Dr. Ribas?
Thank you again. Thank you very much.
Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I think we'll just take 5 minutes.